excited to be speaking to Joseph Howley, who is an associate professor of classics at Columbia University, where he teaches literature and writes about intellectual history. Last year, he joined more than a dozen Jewish faculty members in urging Columbia leadership to reject the right-wing instrumentalization of anti-Semitism charges against the Palestine Solidarity Movement and to defend the university from the MAGA agenda. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's great to be talking to you.
Another Columbia student, Mohsen Mahdawi, was just apprehended by Homeland Security while at an immigration appointment to become a citizen. So what is the atmosphere like at Columbia right now?
Yeah, we were actually having a faculty rally outside with a bunch of researchers and doctors from our medical campus calling on the university to fight back against the Trump attacks when this news broke. I read the news out to the crowd through the megaphone, and there was like a cry of pain from the crowd.
While we've been standing here, we've just had the news that another student activist from our community has been detained by immigration authorities. A student who stood here last year and spoke out against war and for peace and justice has been detained by the immigration authorities.
So many people here know Mohsen. I was standing where I remember him standing last year at a different protest. Everyone knows that Mohsen is someone who speaks out for peace and justice and collective liberation. You know, he said things like, we're against anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism is a form of injustice, and injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. You know, we're already in a situation where, you know, students are speaking up less in class, where international students are afraid to, you know, leave their dorms or come to campus, where my colleagues, other professors who are on visas or green cards, are having friends escort them to and from work and home. So, you know, we were already here all feeling pretty frightened. All of a sudden, it seems like the way the State Department is working is someone can just post some racist allegation about you on social media, and then, you know, goons in masks are dragging you off the street. There was, you know, reporting in The Intercept just a few weeks ago on these WhatsApp groups, like at our university, of Columbia alumni, including faculty and students and parents, that were coordinating specifically to dox and denounce student protesters or other students who they thought were protesters on social media to get them targeted for deportation. And lo and behold, here it is happening. So this is not just about the Trump administration finding people to pick on. It's about people, some of whom are in our own community, who've been singling out people associated with the Palestine movement to have them targeted for the Trump deportation machine.
Tell us more about the role Columbia is playing in this. How are they enabling this crackdown, whether it comes to Mohsen or Mahmoud Khalil?
This is something that we're all still trying to get a lot of information about, and it's not entirely clear. You know, just a couple of days before Mahmoud Khalil was taken, he had written to university leadership asking for protection because he knew he was being targeted and got no response. And some of his friends tell me that his student ID card access to campus was actually revoked with no notice just days before he was taken. There's been some reporting on how he was identified, how Mahmoud was identified, in which people have claimed that you know, someone around the university's board of trustees was actually involved in reporting him to the government. You know, obviously that's being denied, but there hasn't really been full reporting on that. You know, my understanding is that the university is following the law, which, you know, kind of cuts both ways, right? It means you have to have a signed judicial warrant to let ICE agents on campus, right? This is what I'm told. We're only giving the government the bare minimum of information that we're required to under the law. But, you know, I think the really frightening thing, Katie, is that we're in a situation now where university leadership's primary goal seems to be to never make any public statements or commitments that might seem like a defiance of the regime.
What else can you tell us about Mohsen and Mahmoud, you know, as people?
In November of 2023, the university had suspended Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace. And in response to that, a bunch of student groups sort of reactivated a dormant coalition of student groups to work for apartheid divestment goals. And Mohsen was involved in that at an early state. And, I was really impressed from the moment I met him with how careful and thoughtful he was about this work. This was not someone who was calling for people to take over buildings or threatening people or whatever. This is someone who was like building coalitions, building bridges. And Mahmoud was someone who emerged as a mediator and negotiator on behalf of the Gaza Solidarity Encampment. That's how I got to know him. He's also someone who I always know I can pick up the phone and kind of have a candid conversation about difficult things, and he can help me understand, where the movement is at and what's happening. These are both people who have not been afraid to put their names and their faces out there. They've also not been afraid to take positions for collective liberation, right? For peace and justice. These are people who will explain to you that when we say free Palestine, we mean equal rights and freedom for everybody in the land, and that is the vision of Palestinian liberation and the Solidarity Movement that the anti-Palestine, anti-protest crowd doesn't want you to hear. Right. So on the one hand, I think you can really tell that the State Department kind of screwed up and picked the wrong guy when they went for Mahmoud. They really were clearly just like reading someone's tweets and didn't know what they were doing. But on the other hand, I think we do have to recognize that Mohsen and Mahmoud are attractive targets. They and their work that they do and what they embody as Palestinians is really contrary to and gives the lie to the stories that these folks want to tell about what it means to stand up for the Palestinian cause.
Speaking of which, what are your thoughts on the claims of anti-Semitism on Columbia's campus, which, according to, Israel defenders, has infected the pro-Palestine movement, claims about Jewish safety? And how do you feel as a Jewish person about Betar and Canary Mission and the Israeli government claiming to act on our behalf?
Yeah, the pro-Israel extreme right has spent decades trying to convince everybody that if you speak on behalf of the Palestinian cause, that's somehow anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. I think it's disgraceful. I think it's insulting. And, about these groups that you've mentioned, in my upbringing as a Jewish person, I quickly became aware that there were many other kinds of Jewish people and ways to be Jewish in the world. And that even if I didn't agree with all of them, we were all Jews and Jewish. And that's clearly not a view that's widely held. I've been attacked as a, fake Jew. I'm sure you have as well for this or that commitment, right? Having said that, I think that groups like Canary Mission and Betar are betrayals of really everything that I understand Jewishness and history and heritage and values to be about. It's Passover right now, right? I just had a Seder with my kids the other day. We talked about the story that when the Red Sea swallowed up Pharaoh's soldiers and the angels rejoiced, God said, but are they not also the work of my hand, right? That liberation means liberation for all, and that even oppressors need to be liberated. So I look at them and I see fascism and I see authoritarianism and I see a kind of paramilitary movement for the social media age that's threatening. And I'm glad everyone is sort of waking up to the threat that they pose. But you also asked me about these charges of anti-Semitism on our campus. And I think it's really important that we say, first of all, that the fact of pro-Palestine protests does not by itself mean the presence of anti-Semitism, right? Most of the vast majority of what's been happening on this campus and campuses like it around the country has been kids sleeping in tents to protest, the shredding of civilians with American bombs. It's just that simple. Now, when we start looking at real incidents of anti-Jewish harassment and discrimination and prejudice, we can tell that some of this stuff has been happening. Some of it's been perpetrated by non-Columbia people, but near our campus, and some of it has happened on our campus and been perpetrated by members of our community. But then there are a lot of incidents that people don't want to talk about, right? That's been the harassment of our anti-Zionist and anti-war Jewish students by the pro-Israel, anti-protest crowd. And that's also been ugly, despicable treatment. And particularly, there's been harassment and bigotry towards Palestinian, Muslim, and Arab members of our community. If institutions or politicians were really worried about that kind of climate stuff, then they'd be telling a story about what do we do about harassment in the context of war and sectarian conflict and ethnic conflict? That's not the story that the politicians and the ADL and the Board of Trustees have been willing to tell. We also have to bear in mind two things about the realities of anti-Semitism. One is that when the government of Israel slaughters civilians, and they do so, in the name of Jews, or, wrapped in our holiest symbols, when they bulldoze schools and mosques and then bulldoze the Star of David into the ground, that drives anti-Semitism around the world, and it's disgusting to me. And the other thing to say is that the Trump agenda right now, which is disassembling major institutions of civil society in this country in the purported name of Jews and Jewish safety, that's also going to drive anti-Semitism, right? We're being rushed through this authoritarian agenda in the name of Jews, and that's not going to be good for any of us.
Can you talk about what Trump's demands of Colombia have been, how much Colombia has capitulated to them, and what effect that has on education at Colombia, but also around the country and possibly around the world?
This list of demands that the federal government sent my university is really bizarre and frightening. It includes things that don't really make a lot of sense. It included things that were contradictory, like they were demanding that we punish students more, but then they're also demanding that we abolish the body that was punishing students exactly as they requested. I think for a lot of us, one of the most troubling demands was that the Department of Middle Eastern Studies be placed into academic receivership. To be clear, what that means is that the federal government is asserting its right to come into any private university and direct how individual subjects are taught. And that's the kind of thing that happens in like authoritarian illiberal regimes. Now, I want to say two things about this. One, this list of demands from the federal government tracks very closely with a list of demands that was circulated on our campus just a few weeks before by the anti-protest, anti-Palestine faculty and community. And I think that the worst kept secret here is that there is some very close level of collaboration between the anti-protest movement around our campus and the federal government's attack. Individual assertions or allegations or slanders made by anti-protest or pro-Israel activists here have made it into congressional reports or into, law enforcement grilling of our administrators, right? So there's some direct pipeline here. The second thing to say is that you asked me how much has the university capitulated. Well, we still don't even know because a few weeks ago, our leadership made this statement about all the things they said they were going to do. And those things are either exactly what the feds wanted, put in different terms, or they're not at all what the feds wanted. And then all of a sudden, our president was out of a job. And now we have a president who comes out of the Board of Trustees. And now there's rumors about new things that the federal government wants to do. And no one is saying anything to any of us about what's actually going on. But meanwhile, just today, news broke that Harvard University has sent a letter to the federal government explaining that they are in compliance with the law and they will not be putting up with the government's demands and harassment. Just last week, the president of Princeton told the New York Times that they were not going to be putting up with this kind of unlawful and illiberal attack on universities. So, this is a national threat. I mean, the threat is basically that right-wing politicians can come into universities and dictate how any subject is taught. They're starting with Middle East studies and Israel-Palestine, but they've also been cutting funding for scientific research projects that they deem too woke, right? We're really not that far away from the government coming back and saying, now you have to restructure your program on women, gender, and sexuality. Now you have to close down your climate school. Now you can't employ anyone who does research on vaccines. Like, that's already where we are. And I've been really heartened to see other Ivy League universities standing up. I've been heartened to see the faculty at major state research universities standing up and calling on their leadership to stand up. And it's actually starting to get pretty lonely out here. We're starting to wonder why Columbia is the only one of the Ivies that can't seem to find the courage to resist authoritarianism.